My name is Harlan Pierce. I turned 71 on a Thursday that felt like any other day, until it didn't. The air had that early fall edge to it, not quite cold, but no longer forgiving, the kind that settles into your joints before you notice it in your hands. I had been up since 5:40 that morning, out of habit more than necessity, standing in the kitchen with a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm, while the house around me stayed quiet, in a way that didn't feel like sleep. It felt like absence. Nobody said anything. No card on the table, no half-hearted "happy birthday" from the hallway. No text buzzing in from the family group thread that used to light up for smaller things than this. The clock above the stove ticked loud enough to fill the space where voices should have been. And I remember thinking, not angry, not yet, just noting it, the way you note a leak under the sink or a crack in the driveway that wasn't there last winter. You notice, you don't react, not immediately. Evelyn came into the kitchen around 7:15, already dressed, already moving with that quiet efficiency she had perfected over the years, the kind that doesn't invite conversation. She poured herself coffee, didn't look at me, and asked if I had seen the mail from the insurance company. Not good morning, not anything else, just that. I told her it was on the counter by the fruit bowl. She nodded, took it, and left the room while flipping through the pages, already somewhere else in her head. Marcus came down later, closer to 8, keys in hand, phone pressed to his ear, mid-conversation about something that sounded like numbers and deadlines. He walked past me like I was part of the furniture that had been there too long to notice, grabbed a protein bar from the cabinet, and headed for the door without breaking stride. If he saw me, he didn't show it. If he remembered the date, he didn't act like it mattered. I stood there longer than I needed to, holding a coffee mug I wasn't drinking from anymore, listening to the front door open and close, and the house settle again into that same quiet. You would think something like that would hurt all at once, like a clean cut, but it doesn't. It's slower. It's the kind of thing that spreads out over the day, finding its way into the small moments. The way nobody calls. The way the television stays off. The way the house feels like it belongs to someone else, and you're just moving through it carefully so you don't leave a mark. By noon, I had fixed the loose hinge on the back gate, paid 2 bills online, and taken out the trash. The same things I did on any other Thursday. Except this time, there was a quiet realization sitting underneath it all that none of it was being seen as help anymore. It was expected. It had been expected for a long time. I went out in the afternoon, not because I had somewhere to be, but because sitting in that house had started to feel like sitting in a waiting room for something that wasn't coming. I drove to the hardware store out on Route 9, walked the aisles without buying anything, nodded at a man I didn't know who nodded back like we understood something about each other without needing to say it. I checked my phone once in the parking lot before getting back into the truck. No missed calls, no messages. The sun was already starting to dip when I got back, that late-day light turning everything a shade softer than it really was. I parked in the driveway, same spot I'd parked in for 22 years, and sat there for a second longer than usual with the engine off, hands still on the wheel, listening to the ticking sound as the heat faded out of the metal. I remember thinking very clearly, this is what it feels like when something has already ended and nobody bothered to tell you. Before I go any further, before I take you into what happened next, do me a small favor. After you like and leave a comment, I hope something good finds you today. Maybe a little peace, maybe an unexpected kindness. Tell me how old you are, where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. Let's continue. When I stepped out of the truck, the front door was already closed. That wasn't unusual. But the house felt different the second I walked up the path. Quieter than it should have been for that time of day. No television noise, no voices, not even the low hum of the dishwasher that Evelyn usually ran in the evenings. Just stillness. I reached for the handle, the same way I always had, without thinking about it. It didn't turn. That was the first moment something shifted from quiet neglect into something else entirely. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small, precise realization. Locked. From the inside. I knocked once, not hard, just enough to make a sound that carried. I heard movement on the other side. Footsteps, deliberate, not rushed. The door opened a few inches, held by the chain, and Marcus stood there looking at me in a way I hadn't seen before. Not angry, not even irritated, just decided. "Hey," I said, because that's what you say when you don't yet understand what's happening. He didn't answer right away. He looked past me, over my shoulder, like he was checking something behind me, making sure of something. Then he met my eyes, and whatever hesitation might have been there before was gone. "Dad," he said, and his voice was flat in a way that didn't leave room for misunderstanding. "You're just a burden now." There are sentences that land like noise, and there are sentences that land like weight. That one had weight. Not because it was loud, it wasn't, but because it had been thought about before it was said. It had been decided. I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't argue. I didn't even change my expression, not because I didn't feel it, but because I had already learned that reacting in those moments only gives the other person something to push against. Instead, I stood there, hands at my sides, and waited. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small set of keys. I recognized them immediately. Spare copies. Mine used to be on that ring. He stepped back just enough to unhook the chain, opened the door fully for a second, long enough that I thought, briefly, that maybe this was going somewhere else, then stepped outside, closing it behind him so we were both standing on the porch. "I'll need you keys," he said. I looked at him, really looked this time, trying to find something familiar in his face, something that belonged to the boy I had taught to ride a bike in this same driveway, something that would explain this in a way that made sense. There wasn't anything there. I reached into my pocket and took out the keys. The metal felt colder than it should have in my hand. I held them for a second, longer than necessary, then placed them in his palm. He didn't thank me. He turned, opened the door, stepped back inside, and then, without looking at me again, closed it. I heard the lock click, then the second one, then the soft slide of the deadbolt. It's a strange thing, standing outside your own house with nothing in your hands and nowhere immediate to go. The porch light flicked on automatically as the sun dropped lower, casting that pale yellow circle that makes everything look a little less real than it is. I stood there for a moment, maybe longer, I'm not sure, listening to the quiet on the other side of the door. No voices, no movement, just the solid, ordinary silence of a house that had decided it no longer included me. I didn't knock again. I didn't call out. I didn't reach for my phone. Instead, I stepped off the porch, walked back down the path, and got into my truck the same way I had an hour earlier. Except this time, I didn't sit and think about it. I started the engine, put it in reverse, and backed out of the driveway without looking at the house in the mirror. Because the truth is, by the time the door closed, I already understood something that would take them 3 days to figure out. And when they did, when the calls started coming in, one after another, 18 of them, back to back, I didn't answer a single one. Not because I couldn't, because I finally didn't need to. When I retired, nobody said the word "thank you" out loud. not in a way that settled into the room and stayed there long enough to mean something. There was a dinner, there was a cake from the grocery store with my name spelled correctly, but without much thought behind it, and there were a few polite sentences about finally getting to rest. The kind people say because it sounds right, not because they've considered what it actually looks like when a man who has worked 50 years wakes up the next morning without a place he has to be. The truth is, I did rest, for about 3 days. On the fourth morning, Evelyn stood in the kitchen with a stack of envelopes in her hand, the same way she had stood there for years, and she said, in that soft, reasonable voice she used when she was asking for something she had already decided I would do, "Since you're home now, you could take over the bills, couldn't you? It would just make things easier." It didn't sound like a request. It sounded like a small adjustment. I said yes. It wasn't a difficult thing, not at first. I had handled numbers my whole life, just in a different context. Instead of parts and labor and invoices, it was utilities, insurance, property tax, the quiet, steady rhythm of money moving out of the house in measured, predictable ways. I set up a system at the dining room table, a legal pad, a pen that didn't skip, a stack of envelopes sorted by due date. I paid everything on time. I always had. A week later, the faucet in the upstairs bathroom started leaking. Marcus mentioned it in passing, the way you mention the weather, without looking up from his phone. "It's been dripping all night," he said. "It's annoying." I told him I'd take a look at it. I fixed it that afternoon, standing on a step stool with a wrench in my hand, and the slow, familiar satisfaction of something mechanical giving way to pressure in exactly the way it was supposed to. It took 20 minutes. Nobody said anything about it afterward. The drip stopped. That was enough. A few days after that, Lydia called from the other house. Marcus and Lydia had moved into a place 10 minutes away, but their problems still had a way of landing at my feet, and said the garage door wouldn't close properly. She laughed a little when she said it, light, apologetic, like she was aware she was asking for something, but not enough to stop asking. "If you're free," she added, which wasn't really a question. I drove over. I adjusted the track, tightened the bolts, showed her how to reset the sensor. She thanked me, but it was the kind of thanks that ends before it fully begins, already moving on to the next thing. By the second month, there was a pattern forming, not sharp enough to call out, but consistent enough that it didn't need to be. If something broke, I fixed it. If a bill needed to be paid, I paid it. If a call had to be made to the insurance company, I made it, sitting on hold for 40 minutes at a time, listening to recorded voices telling me how important my call was, while the afternoon light moved slowly across the kitchen floor. Evelyn had a way of presenting these things that made them sound smaller than they were. "Antia nam nonye?" she would say in Vietnamese sometimes, a phrase she had picked up years ago and never quite let go of, something between a suggestion and an expectation. "You're already here, you might as well." It always came wrapped in a tone that made refusal feel unreasonable, so I didn't refuse. Marcus, for his part, stopped asking altogether. He didn't need to. The system had settled into place. If the car needed maintenance, I took it in. If there was a question about the mortgage, I handled it. If Lydia's babysitter canceled, which happened more often than it should have, my phone would ring, and I would already know what the conversation was going to be before I answered. "Hey, Dad," Marcus would say, not unkindly, just efficiently. "Any chance you could swing by for a couple hours?" It was never a couple hours. It was an afternoon that turned into an evening, sitting on the living room floor with a child who wanted to play the same game over and over again, while the television played something in the background that I wasn't really watching. It was reheating leftovers, wiping down counters, making sure the doors were locked before I left. It was work. Not the kind you clock in for, not the kind that gets acknowledged, but the kind that fills the space where your time used to belong to you. I didn't notice when it stopped feeling temporary. There was a Tuesday. I remember it because the trash pickup had been delayed a day for a holiday, when I was sitting at the dining room table with the bills spread out in front of me, and a list of things that needed to be done for both houses. And I realized I hadn't had a day that was entirely mine in weeks. Not one. There was always something waiting, something small, something reasonable, something that, taken on its own, didn't feel like much. Taken together, it was everything. That was the day I bought the notebook. It wasn't anything special, just a small spiral-bound pad from the office supply store, the kind you can slide into a jacket pocket without thinking about it. I picked it up along with a pack of pens that wrote clean and didn't smudge, paid in cash, and didn't mention it to anyone when I got home. I didn't start it because I was planning anything. I started it because I was forgetting things. Not in a way that scared me, not in the way people talk about when they mean memory loss, but in the way small tasks blur together when there are too many of them. Had I paid the water bill or just opened it? Did I fix the latch on the back gate last week or the week before? How many times had I driven across town to watch the kids when the babysitter canceled? So I wrote it down. Tuesday, paid electric, called insurance, fixed garage sensor at Marcus's. Wednesday, grocery run for Evelyn, replaced porch light, watched kids 3 to 7. Thursday, property tax online, oil change for Marcus's car, picked up medication. At first, it was just that, a record, a way to keep things straight. But something happens when you start putting your time on paper. It stops being abstract. It stops being something that disappears at the end of the day. It becomes visible, even if you're the only one looking at it. I didn't change what I was doing. I still said yes when Evelyn asked in that soft voice that made everything sound optional when it wasn't. I still answered when Marcus called, still drove across town, still sat in waiting rooms and on hold and in quiet kitchens doing things that needed to be done. But I started to see it differently. There was a Friday, late afternoon, when I was standing in the driveway at Marcus's house with a toolbox open on the ground, fixing a loose panel on the side of the garage, when Lydia came out with a glass of iced tea and handed it to me with a smile that was meant to be kind. "We don't know what we'd do without you," she said. It sounded like gratitude. It felt like something else. I took the glass, nodded, and went back to tightening the screws, the metal cool under my fingers, the sound of the drill steady and predictable in a way that conversation wasn't anymore. That night, I wrote it down. Friday, garage panel repair, 2 hours. Lydia said, "We don't know what we'd do without you." I didn't underline it. I didn't circle it. I just wrote it the same way I wrote everything else, in the same steady hand, on the same small page. Because at that point, I still believed I was just keeping track. I hadn't yet realized I was building something I was going to need. The house, back then, still felt like mine in ways that would start to disappear later. But even then, there were moments, small, quiet ones, when I could feel the edges shifting. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Decisions that had already been made before I was informed of them. Papers left on the table that didn't include my name in the way they used to. Nothing you could point to on its own. Nothing you could argue about without sounding unreasonable. So, I didn't argue. I wrote things down. I wrote down dates, times, what was said, what was done. Not because I thought anyone would ever ask, not because I imagined I would ever show it to someone else, but because something in me, something quiet and persistent, understood that there was a difference between living through something and having a record of it. And that difference matters. I didn't know yet how much it was going to matter. I didn't know that one day I would stand outside my own house with no keys in my hand and a locked door in front of me, and understand that everything I had written in that small notebook had been leading to that moment. At the time, it just felt like a way to keep things straight, a way to remember, a way to make sure that the days I was giving away didn't disappear entirely without a trace. There wasn't a single day I could point to and say, that's when it changed. If you had asked me in the moment, I would have told you everything was fine, that nothing had really shifted, that houses don't stop belonging to you all at once. They change in smaller ways, quieter ways, the kind that don't ask for permission and don't leave behind a clean line you can stand on and argue from. The first thing that went was the chair. It had been mine for years, a worn leather recliner near the living room window where the light came in strongest in the late afternoon. The kind of light that makes dust visible in the air if you sit still long enough to notice it. I used to sit there after dinner with the television on low, not really watching, just letting the noise fill the space while the day settled into something quieter. The armrest had a mark from where my elbow rested. The leather softened in that one spot in a way that matched the shape of me. One evening, I came in from the garage and it wasn't there. In its place was a smaller chair, newer, firmer, something that didn't have a history yet. Lydia was sitting on the couch with her phone, her legs tucked under her, and she looked up just long enough to register that I had noticed. "Oh," she said, like it had just occurred to her. "We moved that old chair into the storage room. It was taking up space and we needed more room for the play area." She gestured toward the corner where a bright foam mat had been laid out, covered in plastic toys that made small sounds when you stepped too close to them. There was nothing wrong with it. It made sense. Children need space. Families adjust. I nodded. I didn't ask why nobody had mentioned it. I didn't go to the storage room to look at it. I sat in the new chair that didn't quite fit the same way and watched the television at a volume I didn't remember setting. That night, I wrote it down. Chair moved. Storage room. Needed more space. The words looked smaller on the page than the moment had felt. After that, it was smaller things at first. A drawer in the kitchen that used to hold my tools, the ones I kept inside because they were used often enough to justify the space, was reorganized. Not emptied, not exactly, just reassigned. The tools were still there, but pushed to the back, replaced in front by things that belonged to everyone else. Measuring cups, extra utensils, a stack of dish towels folded too neatly to be mine. Evelyn stood beside me one morning while I was looking for a screwdriver and said, "I just tidied it up a bit. It was getting cluttered." It wasn't cluttered. It was mine. But I said, "That's fine," because saying anything else would have turned it into something it didn't yet have a name for. The house began to feel like that drawer. Not taken from me in a way you could object to, but rearranged until what was mine was still technically there, just harder to reach, easier to overlook, easier to forget. The bedroom changed next. It happened on a Saturday, the kind of Saturday that starts slow and ends with more being done than anyone planned. I had gone out in the morning to pick up a part for the water heater at Marcus's place, something small that needed replacing, and when I came back in the afternoon, the hallway looked different. The door to my bedroom was open. Boxes were stacked against the wall, not sealed, just placed there temporarily. The way people place things when they mean to come back to them, but don't have a clear plan for when. I stepped inside and stopped without meaning to. The bed was still there, but the sheets had been stripped. The dresser drawers were half open, clothes folded differently than I would have folded them. Not wrong, just not mine. On the far side of the room, against the wall where the bookshelf had been, there was now a crib. I stood there long enough for the silence to settle around me in a way that felt heavier than it should have. Evelyn appeared in the doorway behind me, her reflection catching in the mirror before I turned around. "We thought it would be easier," she said, her voice even, practical, like she was explaining a schedule change. "With the baby staying over more, it just makes sense to have the room closer to everything." Closer to everything meant closer to them, further from me. "And you," she added, as if remembering there was still a piece of the conversation left to account for. "We set up the downstairs room for you. It's quieter down there. You'll probably sleep better." The downstairs room had always been a storage space, a place where things went when they didn't have a place anywhere else. Old boxes, unused furniture, things kept not because they were needed, but because nobody had decided to let them go. I looked at the crib again, the soft blanket folded neatly inside it, the small mobile hanging above it, turning slowly in the air from a movement I hadn't seen. "Okay," I said, not because I agreed, because I understood. That evening, I carried my own things downstairs. Not everything, just what I needed. A few shirts, a pair of shoes, the notebook, the pen that didn't skip. I left the rest where it was, not out of resistance, but because something in me knew that once you start moving everything, you're acknowledging a change that hasn't been said out loud yet. The downstairs room smelled faintly of dust and something older, something that had been sitting undisturbed for too long. There was a bed, a narrow one pushed against the wall, a small lamp, a chair that didn't match anything else in the house. I set my things down, sat on the edge of the bed, and listened to the sounds from upstairs. Footsteps, a drawer opening, the low hum of conversation that didn't carry clearly enough to make out words. It felt like listening to a house I used to live in. That night, I wrote it down. Bedroom changed. Crib. Make sense? Moved downstairs. The sentences were still steady. The handwriting didn't change. A week later, I noticed my name wasn't on the electricity bill. It wasn't something I had been looking for. It was something I saw by accident, the way you see a detail in a photograph after you've already looked at it once. I had the bill in my hand, standing at the kitchen counter, the envelope already torn open, the numbers already processed in the part of my brain that handled that without effort. At the top, where there had always been two names, there was now one. Evelyn Pierce. My name wasn't there. I turned the page over, checked the account number, the address, everything that would confirm I wasn't looking at the wrong document. It was the right one. Evelyn came into the kitchen while I was still holding it, and I held it out slightly, not accusing, not questioning, just presenting it. "They updated the account," she said before I could ask anything, her tone calm, already prepared. "It's simpler this way. Less confusion." Less confusion. I nodded. I didn't ask when that had happened. I didn't ask why I hadn't been told. I didn't ask what else had been simplified. I folded the bill, set it down on the counter, and went to the sink to rinse out a cup that didn't need rinsing. That night, I wrote it down. Electric bill. Name removed. Simpler. There were other bills after that. Water, insurance, small things that, one by one, stopped including me in ways that didn't require a conversation. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to and say, "This is wrong," without sounding like you were making something out of nothing. But taken together, they formed a pattern, a quiet, steady removal. I didn't confront anyone about it. I didn't raise my voice or demand explanations. I continued to do the things I had been doing. I paid what needed to be paid. I fixed what needed to be fixed. I showed up when I was expected to show up. But I wrote everything down. Dates, changes, words that were said in passing that carried more meaning than they were meant to. Because by then, something had shifted inside me. Not loud enough to call it anger, not sharp enough to call it betrayal, but clear enough to recognize that what was happening wasn't temporary and it wasn't accidental. It was a process, and I was being moved through it, slowly, quietly, without anyone ever having to say it out loud. The house didn't stop feeling like mine in one moment. It stopped in 100 small ways. And by the time I realized how much of it had already been taken, there was very little left that still had my name on it. The first document appeared on a Monday morning, although at the time I did not understand that it had appeared for me to find. I thought I had found it by accident, which is what people like Marcus count on when they leave things in places where an old man might see them and then blame his own curiosity for looking too closely. It was a gray morning, the kind that makes the windows look dirty even when they are clean, and I had been in the kitchen paying the water bill from the laptop Evelyn now kept on the counter instead of in the office. The office had slowly become Marcus's workspace whenever he came over, even though he had his own house, his own desk, his own locked drawers. Mine had become a place where papers were stacked but not explained. The printer in the hall started blinking. It did that sometimes after Evelyn printed something from her phone. The paper would jam halfway out, and because nobody else in the house believed in opening the back panel before pulling, I had become the person who fixed it. I walked over with my coffee still in my hand, set the mug on the small table by the hallway lamp, and opened the printer tray. There were 3 pages sitting there, not jammed, printed clean. The top page had a title in bold across the upper left corner, Quitclaim Deed. I did not move for a few seconds, not because I didn't know what those words meant, but because I knew them well enough to understand that they did not belong casually in a hallway printer on a Monday morning. I picked up the pages and held them the way you hold something delicate when you are not sure yet whether it is broken or dangerous. The document had our address on it. The house. The same house I had bought with Evelyn 27 years earlier. The house where I had patched the roof twice, rebuilt the back steps after the winter storm of '09, replaced the furnace with my own hands because we could not afford the labor then. The house where Marcus had learned to shave, where Evelyn had planted hydrangeas that never quite bloomed right, where I had spent most of my retired life being useful, until useful turned into invisible. The document transferred interest in the property, from Evelyn Pierce to Marcus Pierce and Lydia Pierce. My name was not on the first page. I read it again because sometimes your eyes protect you the first time. They soften what they don't want to deliver. The second reading was cleaner, colder. There was Evelyn's name listed as grantor. There were Marcus and Lydia listed as grantees. There was the property description copied from the county record, the parcel number, the legal description of the lot lines that ran behind the old oak and along the drainage ditch. There was no Harlan Pierce. Not once. The coffee on the hallway table cooled while I stood there, and the house made its normal sounds around me. The refrigerator hummed, a pipe ticked in the wall. Somewhere upstairs a door closed softly. Ordinary sounds have a cruel way of continuing when your life has just shifted underneath them. I turned to the second page. There was a signature line. Evelyn M. Pierce. The signature was there, or something trying to be there. It leaned the way hers leaned, carried the same large E, the same long crossing stroke through the final letters, the same little upward lift at the end that made her name look more confident than her voice ever did. But it was not hers. I knew that before I knew how I knew it. Marriage teaches you handwriting the way weather teaches you seasons. You don't study it, you absorb it. I had seen Evelyn's signature on birthday cards, mortgage papers, school forms, checks, Christmas envelopes, insurance claims, hospital releases, and every grocery list she wrote when she wanted me to buy the exact brand and not the one I thought was close enough. Her signature had a rhythm, even when she was rushed. The first stroke always pressed harder than the rest. The M in the middle of her name rose slightly higher than the surrounding letters, like it was standing up straight in a room full of people slouching. This one did not. The pressure was wrong. Too even, too careful. Like someone had traced confidence instead of writing it. The notary block was blank. That was the part I noticed third, and the third thing is often the one that tells you where the story is going. The signature was there, but the notary section had not been completed. No stamp, no date, no commission number, no county. Just empty lines waiting for someone to make them official. I stood there long enough for the printer to go back to sleep. Then I heard Evelyn's voice from upstairs. "Harlan?" It wasn't alarmed, it wasn't guilty. It was ordinary, which made it worse. "Yes," I said. "Did the printer jam again?" I looked at the pages in my hand. I looked at the blank notary section. I looked at my own name not being there. "No," I said. "It printed fine." A pause. "Just leave it on the counter, please. Marcus needs those." Marcus needs those. Not, "What are you looking at?" Not, "Those aren't ready." Not even, "I'll take them." Just the calm assumption that if something belonged to Marcus, I would carry it to the place where Marcus expected it to be. I said, "All right." My voice sounded normal. I remember that more clearly than almost anything else from that morning. It sounded like the voice of a man who had found nothing strange in the hallway, a man who was still part of the house, a man who did not yet understand that his name had been removed from the place where he slept. I walked to the kitchen and set the pages on the counter beside the fruit bowl. Then I picked them back up. Not quickly, not dramatically. I simply lifted them again, as if straightening them, and took out my phone. The first photograph was crooked because my hand had not fully settled. I took another, then another. One of the full page, one of the title, one of the property description, one close on the signature, one close on the blank notary block. The phone camera made no sound because I had turned that off years earlier after taking pictures of serial numbers on machine parts. Quiet habits become useful in strange ways. I opened my small notebook and wrote the date. Monday, 8:42 a.m. Hall printer. Quitclaim deed. House transfer to Marcus and Lydia. My name missing. Evelyn's signature questionable. Notary blank. I did not underline anything. I did not circle anything. I closed the notebook and slid it back into my pocket. By the time Evelyn came downstairs, the papers were on the counter, exactly where she had asked me to put them. I was at the sink washing a coffee mug that was already clean. She came into the kitchen wearing the blue cardigan she used when she wanted to look calm. She did not reach for the papers immediately. That was how I knew she knew I had seen them. People who are hiding something often try too hard not to look at it. "Marcus is stopping by later," she said. I figured. "It's just paperwork." I turned off the faucet and set the mug in the drying rack. "What kind?" She looked at me then, and for half a second I saw something move across her face. Not fear, exactly, not regret, but a calculation so fast it almost passed for tiredness. "Estate planning," she said. "Nothing you need to worry about." Estate planning. That was the phrase they had chosen. Clean, respectable, impossible to argue with unless you wanted to sound like an old man afraid of responsible decisions. I nodded. She picked up the pages and tapped them once against the counter to straighten the edges. Her hand shook slightly, just once, and then stopped. I saw it. I wrote it down later. Marcus came by at 5:30 with Lydia in the passenger seat of his SUV, and neither of the kids with them, which was unusual enough to matter. They didn't stay for dinner. They came in with the energy of people who had planned a quick visit but wanted it to look casual. Marcus hugged his mother. Lydia kissed the air near Evelyn's cheek and smiled at me like I was a neighbor she had once met at a block party. "Hey, Harlan," she said. Not Dad. Not even Mr. Pierce. Harlan. Marcus took the papers from Evelyn and slid them into a folder he had brought with him. A black folder with a silver clip. He did not ask where they had been. He did not ask whether I had seen them. He simply took them, and while he did, his eyes moved once toward me and away again. That one glance told me more than any confession would have. He knew. He knew I had seen something, but he did not know how much I understood. That was the first advantage I had been given in weeks, maybe months, and I did not waste it by speaking. At dinner, Evelyn made chicken even though nobody ate much of it. Marcus checked his phone under the table. Lydia asked about the weather for the weekend. I answered when someone spoke to me and stayed quiet when they didn't. The whole evening had the quality of a room where someone had hidden a broken glass and everyone was walking carefully, pretending they didn't hear the crunch under their shoes. After they left, Evelyn took a long time washing dishes that could have gone into the dishwasher. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her shoulders move under the cardigan. "Everything all right?" I asked. She did not turn around. "Yes," she said. "Everything's fine." I believed she wanted that to be true. That is not the same as believing her. That night, in the downstairs room, I opened my phone and looked at the photographs again. The signature, the missing name, the blank notary block. The phrase estate planning sitting in my head like a clean label on a dirty jar. I copied the photos into a folder and named it House Documents. Then I backed them up to a second folder because a man who has fixed machines his whole life learns one thing early. If something matters, you do not keep only one copy. I put the phone down beside the bed. The house above me creaked as someone walked across the floor that used to be mine. I lay there in the dark, listening. I still did not know what they were planning, but now I knew there was a plan. There is a particular way people speak when they believe you are no longer part of the conversation. A slight lowering of the voice that is not meant to hide the words completely, only to soften them enough that if you do hear, you will doubt your own ears before you question theirs. I did not notice that tone all at once, because it arrived the same way everything else had been arriving in that house. Gradually, layered into ordinary moments until it became something you could not unhear once you recognized it. It started in the kitchen, late in the afternoon, with the window cracked open just enough to let in a line of cooler air that moved the edge of the curtain in slow, uneven motions. I had come upstairs to refill a glass of water and had stopped at the hallway when I heard Marcus's voice coming from the dining room. Not loud, not angry, just measured in a way that suggested he was explaining something he had already explained before. Lydia answered him, her voice softer but clearer, the kind that carries even when it isn't trying to. "Do you really think you'll notice?" she asked. There was a pause, long enough that I could picture Marcus leaning back in his chair, the way he did when he was considering how much to say. "He won't question anything," he said finally. The words were simple. They didn't need to be complicated. They carried their meaning cleanly, without hesitation, without doubt, as if they had been said more than once already, as if they had become something close to fact in his mind. I stood there with my hand still on the wall, the paint cool against my palm, and I did not move. There are moments when a man realizes he has been placed in a category without his consent, and that category has already been accepted by the people around him, not because they have proven it, but because it makes things easier if it is true. "He's never questioned anything," Lydia said, and there was something almost reassuring in her tone, like she was reminding Marcus of a pattern that had held so far. "Not once." "That's because he doesn't understand half of it," Marcus replied. "And the other half, he just goes along." Goes along. I let the phrase settle the way you let a tool settle into your hand before you use it. I did not step into the room. I did not make a sound that would let them know I was there. I simply listened, not because I was looking for something, but because something had already found me. "What about your mom?" Lydia asked. "She'll have to sign too." "She will," Marcus said, with a certainty that did not invite discussion. "She always does. It just takes time. You just have to present it the right way." Present it the right way. There was a rustle of paper, the sound of a folder being opened, the same small, controlled movement I had seen the day before when he took the quitclaim deed from the kitchen counter. The same folder, I imagined. The same pages. The same plan moving forward in increments that looked reasonable when you didn't step back far enough to see the whole shape. "And him?" Lydia asked. Another pause. "He signs what she tells him to sign," Marcus said. "That's how it's always worked." I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to hear the sentence without the distraction of the hallway around me. I wanted to make sure I understood it exactly as it had been meant. He signs what she tells him to sign. I opened my eyes and stepped quietly back down the hall, away from the doorway, away from the part of the house where conversations were happening that did not include me except as a subject. I walked down the stairs slowly, the way I always had, one hand brushing the railing, not because I needed the support, but because habit becomes its own kind of anchor. In the downstairs room, I sat on the edge of the bed and took out the notebook. I wrote the date. Afternoon. Kitchen. Marcus plus Lydia. He won't question anything. He doesn't understand. He signs what she tells him to sign. I did not add anything else. I did not interpret it. I did not underline the words that carried the most weight. I let them sit on the page exactly as they had been said, because something in me had already begun to understand that accuracy matters more than emphasis when the time comes to show something to someone who is not there to hear it. That evening, Evelyn came downstairs with a stack of papers in her hand. She did not sit. She did not make it into a conversation. She stood near the door, the same way she had stood in the kitchen that morning, holding documents as if they were part of the ordinary flow of the day. "Harlan," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. "I need you to sign a few things." I looked at her, then at the papers, then back at her face. There was nothing in her expression that suggested urgency or discomfort. If anything, there was a kind of practiced ease, the same tone she used when asking me to pick up groceries or call the insurance company. Something that made the request feel smaller than it was. "What are they?" I asked. "Just updates," she said. "Insurance, some account adjustments, nothing complicated." Nothing complicated. She stepped closer and handed me the pen before I had reached for it. A small detail, but one that carried its own meaning. The assumption was already in place. The sequence had been rehearsed. I took the pen. I took the papers. I sat down at the small table by the bed and looked at the first page. It was a form I recognized in structure, if not in content. The kind of document that uses familiar language to make unfamiliar changes feel routine. Names, addresses, account numbers, sections marked for signature, lines that implied consent without requiring full comprehension. My name was on this one. That was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed was the way the language had been arranged. Not wrong, Not fraudulent in a way that would stand out to someone who had not spent years reading documents line by line. But there was a shift in emphasis, a quiet redirection of authority. Small clauses that moved responsibility from one place to another without drawing attention to themselves. I read it once, then I read it again. Evelyn stood there while I did, not impatient, not pressing, but present in a way that suggested she expected the process to move forward without interruption.
"You don't have to read all of that," she said after a moment, her tone light, almost amused. "It's standard."
Standard? I looked up at her. "I like to read what I sign," I said. She smiled then, a small, controlled movement that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course you do." I went back to the page. I did not argue. I did not question. I did not point out the places where the language shifted in ways that mattered. I let the silence stretch just long enough to change the rhythm of the moment, just long enough for her to register that something was different without being able to name exactly what. Then I signed. Not because I had decided to agree, because I had decided to watch. I signed where my name was required, my handwriting steady, the same as it had been for years, the same as it appeared on every document in the house that still carried it. I turned the page and signed again. And again. When I was finished, I handed the papers back to her. "Thank you," she said, and this time the word was clearer, more deliberate, as if she had noticed the pause, the reading, the fact that something had shifted, even if she did not yet understand how far. She left the room with the papers held carefully in both hands. I sat there for a moment longer, the pen still in my fingers, the imprint of the signatures faintly visible in the pressure marks on the page beneath. Then I opened the notebook. Evening. Evelyn. Papers presented as updates. Language shifted. Signed. Read fully. I added one more line. They think I don't understand. I closed the notebook and set it on the table. The house above me moved in its usual patterns. Footsteps, a chair being pulled back, the low murmur of voices that did not need to lower themselves anymore, because the assumption had already been made. He won't question anything. I lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling, at the small crack that ran from one corner to the other, a line that had been there long enough to become part of the structure, something nobody noticed unless they were lying still long enough to follow it with their eyes. I followed it from one end to the other, and for the first time I understood that the difference between what they believed and what was actually true was going to matter. Not immediately, but soon. The first thing I refused was the garbage disposal. It was a small thing, small enough that anyone listening from the outside would have said I was being difficult, which is how these things work when people have gotten used to your labor being quiet. If you stop doing one large thing, they can see the shape of it. If you stop doing one small thing, they call it attitude. It was a Sunday evening, and Evelyn was standing at the kitchen sink with one hand on the counter and the other holding a wooden spoon, like she had been interrupted in the middle of something important. The disposal had jammed again. It made that low humming sound when she flipped the switch, the sound of a motor trying to work against something it couldn't move. "Harlan," she called, not loudly, because she didn't have to call loudly anymore. I was sitting in the downstairs room with my notebook open on the small table, copying the week's entries into cleaner lines, because I had started noticing that my first notes were sometimes too fast, too crowded, too much like a man writing while swallowing things he wanted to say. I heard the disposal hum. I heard her call again. I went upstairs. She pointed toward the sink without looking at me. "It's stuck again." I stood beside her and looked down into the drain. I could have fixed it in less than 5 minutes. I knew where the small Allen wrench was. I knew the angle. I knew the feel of the motor freeing itself after one careful turn from underneath. But that evening I said, "You should call someone." Evelyn turned her head slowly, as if she hadn't heard me correctly. What? You should call a plumber or an appliance man, someone who handles those. She gave a small laugh, but it wasn't a laugh that had humor in it. It was the kind of sound people make when they expect the sentence to correct itself before they have to respond seriously. Harlan, you always fix it. I know. The room stayed quiet after that, except for the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing outside. She looked at me longer than she needed to, searching my face for the part of me that usually stepped in before discomfort had to stay in the room too long. I didn't offer anything else. Finally, she turned the switch off, harder than necessary, and said, "Fine." That night, I wrote it down. Sunday. Disposal jammed. Declined to repair. Suggested professional. Evelyn upset. It looked plain on the page. It didn't show the way the air had changed. The second thing I refused was Marcus's oil change. He called me Tuesday morning while I was folding laundry from the dryer, my own clothes mixed in with towels that were not mine, because even after everything, the habits of a house don't stop all at once. His name appeared on my phone, and I let it ring twice before answering, not because I was busy, but because I wanted to remember I had the right to choose when my hand moved. "Dad," he said, already in motion somewhere, keys rattling, a door closing behind him. "Can you swing by later and take my truck in? The oil light came on, and I've got meetings all day." I looked at the basket in front of me, one towel folded, one still warm across my lap. "No," I said. There was a silence so immediate, it felt like the line had dropped. "What?" "I can't do that today. It'll take an hour. Then it should be easy for you to schedule." He breathed out through his nose. I could hear it. I had heard that sound when he was 15, and I told him he couldn't borrow the truck after denting the bumper. Back then, it had belonged to a boy. Now it belonged to a man who had learned to dress entitlement in adult language. "Dad, I'm slammed." "I understand. So you'll do it?" "No." The silence came back, but this time it was heavier. He didn't know where to put it. "Since when?" That was the question beneath everything. Not why, not what changed. "Since when did you stop being available?" "Since today," I said. He hung up without saying goodbye. I set the phone down on the dryer and folded the rest of the towels. My hands moved steadily, corner to corner, smooth once, then twice, stacked evenly on top of the machine. It surprised me how calm I felt. Not happy, not triumphant, just clear. That night, I wrote it down. Tuesday, Marcus asked oil change, declined. He hung up. By Thursday, the house had noticed. Not in a direct way. Nobody sat me down. Nobody asked if something was wrong, because asking that would have required acknowledging that something might have been wrong before I stopped helping. Instead, the irritation moved through the house in small sounds. Cabinet doors closing harder. Evelyn speaking to Marcus in the next room and lowering her voice only after she had already said my name. Lydia sending a text with too many polite words wrapped around a request I did not answer right away. "Hi, Harlan. Hope you're having a good day. Any chance you could watch the kids tomorrow from 2 to 6? It would really help us out." I looked at the message for a long time. Then I wrote back, "No, I'm not available." She replied 3 minutes later, "Oh, is everything okay?" I did not answer that. Not because everything was okay, because she was not asking the question she thought she was asking. That evening, Marcus came over. I heard his SUV before I saw it. The familiar crunch of tires in the driveway. The engine left running for a few seconds after he parked. The impatient rhythm of him moving through the front door like the house still belonged more to him than to me. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the notebook closed beside my hand. He didn't sit. "Mom says you wouldn't fix the disposal." "That's right." "And you wouldn't take my truck in." "That's right." "And now Lydia says you won't watch the kids." "I said I wasn't available." He stared at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw confusion behind his irritation. It wasn't fear yet. It wasn't even concern. It was the confusion of a man pressing a switch and finding that the light no longer came on. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked. I took a sip of coffee. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. "I'm resting." He looked almost offended by the word. "You're retired." "Yes." "So what are you resting from?" That one almost made me smile. Not because it was funny, but because it was honest in a way he did not understand. He truly did not know. The work had been so invisible to him that, in his mind, there was nothing for me to be tired from. I set the cup down carefully. "From being expected." Evelyn came into the kitchen then, slow enough that I knew she had been listening from the hall. Her face was controlled, but there was a tightness near her mouth that told me she had already decided this was not going to be allowed to become normal. "Harlan," she said softly, "nobody's trying to take advantage of you." I looked at her. I thought of the quitclaim deed. I thought of the papers she had handed me in the downstairs room. I thought of my name missing from bills, from rooms, from decisions. I thought of Marcus saying, "He won't question anything." "I didn't say anyone was," I said. That was the truth, at least out loud. Marcus leaned both hands on the back of a chair. "Then why are you acting like this?" "Like what?" "Like everything is a problem." I looked at him for a moment, at the man my son had become, at the expensive watch on his wrist, at the careful haircut, at the impatience he mistook for authority. "Everything isn't a problem," I said. "Some things just aren't mine to solve." He laughed once, short and sharp. "You've always helped." "I know." "So, now you're just done?" I didn't answer right away because the answer was not as simple as he wanted it to be. I was not done being a father. I was not done being decent. I was not done caring about the people I had spent my life caring for. But I was done confusing love with unpaid obedience. "I'm done being automatic," I said. Nobody spoke after that. The clock above the stove ticked. The same clock that had ticked on my birthday morning while nobody said anything. The same clock that had probably watched more of this family than any of us wanted to admit. Marcus pushed the chair back into the table harder than necessary and walked out. Evelyn stayed. For a moment, she looked older than she usually let herself look. Not fragile, not sorry, just older. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. I almost asked what this meant. I didn't. Instead, I picked up the notebook and stood. "Maybe," I said. Then I went downstairs. That night, I wrote more than usual. Thursday, Marcus confronted. Evelyn listened. I said I was resting. Marcus asked what I was resting from. I said being expected. Marcus angry. Evelyn said I was making this harder than it needs to be. I paused over the last line. Then I added one more sentence. They know there is something to make harder. I sat with that sentence for a while. The room was quiet. The house above me was not. I could hear voices moving from kitchen to hallway to living room, low and urgent now, no longer pretending to be casual. I could not make out every word, but I didn't need to. The tone told me enough. For years, I had believed peace in a family meant keeping things running. That night, I understood peace had been confused with silence. And silence, when it only works because one person keeps swallowing the truth, is not peace at all. It is maintenance. I had spent my whole life fixing things. For the first time, I decided to let something stay broken long enough for everyone else to notice. There is a difference between remembering something and being able to prove it, and most people do not think about that difference until they are forced to stand inside it. Memory feels enough when things are ordinary, when trust is still intact, when a man can say, "I did this," and the people around him accept it without asking for a record. But once that trust shifts, once the ground underneath it begins to move, memory stops being solid ground. It becomes something softer, something that can be questioned, reshaped, dismissed. Paper does not do that. Paper stays where you put it. That was the week my notebook changed. Up until then, it had been a way to keep track, a small habit that made the days easier to hold on to. But after the conversation in the kitchen, after the realization that they had already decided what I understood and what I did not, I began to write differently. Not faster, not more, just more precisely. I started with the dates. I had always written them, but now I made sure they were exact, down to the time when it mattered. Morning, afternoon, 8:42 a.m., 5:30 p.m. The details that make something verifiable instead of vague. Then I wrote the tasks. Not in general terms, not fixed something or helped with bills, but in the kind of language that leaves no room for interpretation. Monday, 9:10 a.m. Paid water bill online. Account ending 4472. $186.34. Monday, 11:30 a.m. Replaced kitchen faucet washer. Parts from garage toolbox. No cost. Tuesday, 2 p.m. Watched children at Marcus's house. 2:15 to 6:40 p.m. Provided dinner. Groceries purchased. $42.17. Wednesday, 10:05 a.m. Called insurance regarding policy adjustment. On hold, 38 minutes. Spoke with Representative Karen. Changes confirmed. I wrote it the way I had written invoices for decades, the way I had documented repairs, the way I had learned early in life that if something mattered, you wrote it down so clearly that someone who had never met you could understand what had happened. Then I added the money. That part came slower, not because it was difficult, but because it required me to look at something I had not been looking at before. The receipts were already there, in the kitchen drawer, in my wallet, in the glove compartment of the truck. Small pieces of paper that, on their own, meant nothing more than a transaction. But together, they told a story. I started collecting them. I flattened them out on the table in the downstairs room, smoothed the creases with the side of my hand, and lined them up by date. Groceries, gas, hardware store purchases, pharmacy runs, things I had paid for without thinking because that was what needed to be done. I added them to the notebook. Friday, 3:20 p.m. Hardware store, garage panel repair supplies, $28.63. Saturday, 1:05 p.m. Groceries for Evelyn, list provided, $76.14. Sunday, 5:40 p.m. Takeout for Marcus family, babysitter canceled, $53.90. The numbers were not large on their own. They did not need to be. They accumulated. The next step came naturally, the way the next step in a repair reveals itself once you have opened the panel and seen what is inside. I began to compare. The bills in the kitchen, the statements Evelyn left on the counter, the insurance notices, The account summaries that still passed through my hands even though my name had begun to disappear from them. I did not take them. I did not hide them. I read them. Electric bill. Paid. Account holder, Evelyn Pierce. Water bill. Paid. Account holder, Evelyn Pierce. Insurance premium. Adjusted. Named insured, Evelyn Pierce. I turned the pages slowly, not because I needed time to understand them, but because I wanted to see the pattern clearly. The money moving out of the house had my hands on it. The names attached to that movement did not include mine. I wrote that down too. Comparison. Bills paid by me. Name not listed. Responsibility present. Recognition absent. The words looked formal on the page. That was intentional. Emotion belongs in a man's chest. Evidence belongs on paper. There was a Wednesday evening, late enough that the house had quieted into that space between dinner and sleep, when I sat at the small table and read through the notebook from the beginning. Not quickly, not skimming. Line by line, the way you read something you might one day need to explain. 43 entries in 2 weeks. 43 instances of time, labor, or money. 43 things that had been expected, completed, and unacknowledged in any way that would survive outside the moment. I did not feel anger when I read them. I felt clarity. If you've spent years doing things for people who slowly stopped saying thank you, you probably understand this part better than most. There's a quiet kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from the work itself. It comes from being expected without being seen, from giving without anything ever being named as giving. And sometimes, the hardest thing isn't leaving. It's realizing you should have seen it sooner, that the line had already been crossed long before you noticed it was there. I closed the notebook and set it down flat on the table. Upstairs, a door closed. Footsteps crossed the floor. The television turned on, low enough that I could not make out the words, only the rhythm of voices speaking to fill space. I picked up the notebook again and turned to a clean page. Then I did something I had not done before. I summarized. Not the individual entries, but the pattern. 2 weeks, 43 tasks, 27 involving financial outlay, 16 involving labor. Total documented spending, $497.18. Total hours, approximately 31. I underlined the totals once, not because I needed to emphasize them for myself, but because I knew that if someone else looked at this one day, their eyes would go to the bottom first. People always look for the result before they look for the process. I wrote one more line beneath it. No compensation. No acknowledgement. I sat back in the chair and looked at the page for a long time. It was still just a notebook. It was still just paper and ink. But it was no longer a habit. It was a record. The next morning, I bought a second notebook. Not because the first one was full, but because something in me understood that one copy is not enough when what you are holding can be taken or dismissed. I kept the original in the downstairs room, in the drawer beneath the table. I kept the second one in the truck, under the seat, wrapped in an old cloth so it would not draw attention if someone happened to look. I copied the entries, not all at once, a few pages at a time, careful, deliberate, the same handwriting, the same structure. Redundancy is not suspicion, it is preparation. By Friday, the house had adjusted to my refusals in the way people adjust to something they do not like but believe will pass. Evelyn asked less directly. Marcus called less often. Lydia added more polite words to her messages, as if courtesy could replace compliance. I did not change my tone. I did not become cold. I simply remained unavailable in the places where I had always been automatically present. And I wrote it down. Friday. Lydia request childcare. Declined. Follow-up message. Tone increased politeness. Saturday. Evelyn requested grocery run. Declined. She went herself. Sunday. Marcus did not call. Patterns reveal themselves quickly when you are no longer inside them. On Sunday night, I sat in the downstairs room with both notebooks open in front of me, the original and the copy, and I compared them line by line. No discrepancies, no missing entries, no changes in wording. Consistency matters. I closed both notebooks and placed them back where they belonged. Then I turned off the lamp and lay down on the bed, the ceiling crack above me running from one corner to the other, like a line that had always been there, but had only recently begun to mean something. For the first time since I had found the document in the hallway, I allowed myself to think about what would happen if I had to show this to someone else. Not to argue, not to accuse, simply to present. The house above me shifted, the familiar sounds settling into place. A life continuing in the same rooms where I had spent decades building something I had not realized could be reassigned without a conversation. I closed my eyes. The notebook was no longer just mine. It was waiting. I did not go looking for help the way people imagine it, not with a plan or a list of names, or even the certainty that help would recognize me if I stood in front of it and asked. I went because something in me had reached the point where continuing alone would have meant pretending I did not understand what I already knew. And I had stopped pretending to myself a few days earlier, when I wrote the totals at the bottom of the page and underlined them once. It was a Wednesday morning when I drove out to the strip of offices 2 towns over, the kind of place that used to be a dental clinic before it became something else, the kind of building that carries its past in the color of the walls and the way the hallway turns too sharply at the end. I had seen the name on a small brass plaque months before, when I was handling a change to an insurance policy from Marcus and Lydia. One of those errands that takes you through doors you don't remember afterward, unless you have a reason to return. Ruth Calder, attorney at law. At the time, it had meant nothing more than a name. That morning, it meant something else. The parking lot was half full, which told me the place was still used by people who had somewhere to be later in the day, people who planned ahead, people who expected their time to matter. I parked near the side, not because it was closer, but because I have always preferred a space where I can see the door without being seen immediately myself. Habit more than strategy. A man learns small things over the years, without knowing when he might need them. I sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off and the notebook in my hand. The original, not the copy. I had considered bringing both, then decided against it. Redundancy is useful, but showing too much at once can look like confusion to someone who does not know you yet. You start with one clear thing. You let it speak. Then you add. I stepped out, locked the door, and walked in. The waiting room smelled faintly of paper and lemon cleaner, the same smell as the downstairs room at home, except here it carried a different meaning. Here it was maintained. It was deliberate. There were chairs arranged in a way that suggested people came in alone and left having said things they had not said anywhere else. A woman at the desk looked up and gave me a nod that was polite but not curious. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to speak with Ms. Calder," I said. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." She hesitated, not because the answer surprised her, but because it required a decision. "She's with a client right now." "I can wait." I sat down in one of the chairs near the window. The light came in at an angle that made the dust visible, the same way it did in my living room, and I watched it move slowly while the clock on the wall counted minutes in a steady rhythm that did not change for anyone. I did not check my phone. I did not review the notebook. I simply sat. After about 20 minutes, the inner door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out, holding a folder close to his chest, as if it contained something he had just been told to take seriously. He did not look at me. He walked past, out the door, and into the parking lot without breaking stride. Then she appeared. Ruth Calder was older than I had expected, not in a way that suggested decline, but in the way that suggests accumulation. Years, cases, decisions, things seen and not forgotten. Her hair was gray, pulled back in a way that did not try to soften it. She wore glasses low on her nose and held a pen in her hand like it belonged there. She looked at me once, directly, and something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not recognition. Assessment. "Mr.," she said. "Pierce. Harlan Pierce." She nodded once. "Do you have a minute, Mr. Pierce?" "I have as long as it takes." She held the door open. "Come in." Her office was simple in the way that comes from someone who has stopped decorating for appearances. There was a desk, a chair on each side, a shelf with files arranged in a system that did not need to be explained, and a window that let in light without drawing attention to itself. She sat behind the desk and did not gesture for me to begin. That was the first thing I noticed. Most people fill silence quickly. They ask questions to move things forward. They offer structure so they can control where the conversation goes. Ruth did not. She waited. I took the notebook out and set it on the desk. "This started as a way to keep track," I said. "Then it became something else." She did not touch it immediately. "What is this?" she asked. "My house," I said. "And the fact that I don't think it's mine anymore." That was all. No long explanation, no list of complaints, just the truth as clearly as I could put it. She leaned forward slightly, opened the notebook, and began to read. She did not skim. She did not flip ahead. She read, line by line, the same way I had written it. The room stayed quiet, except for the sound of paper turning and the occasional movement of her pen as she made a small mark in the margin. Not on my writing, but next to it, as if she were mapping something I had not yet fully seen. After a few minutes, she closed the notebook and looked at me. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "Writing it down?" "Yes." "A few weeks." "And before that?" "I was doing the work. I just wasn't writing it." She nodded. "Do you have anything else?" I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. "I took pictures," I said, and placed it on the desk, turning the screen toward her. The quitclaim deed, the missing name, the signature that was almost, but not quite Evelyn's, the blank notary block. Ruth leaned closer, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. She tapped the screen once to enlarge the signature, then again to move to the notary section. She did not speak for a moment. Then she sat back. "Where did you get this?" "It printed in the hallway." "And you did not sign it?" "No." "Has your wife acknowledged it?" "She called it estate planning." Ruth's mouth tightened just enough to register. "That's one way to describe it," she said. She picked up her pen and turned to a clean sheet of paper on her desk. "Let's take this one step at a time, Mr. Pierce. Because what you have here is not just a family disagreement." She tapped the phone lightly. "This document, as it stands, is incomplete. No notary, no execution. That matters. But more importantly," she paused, then tapped the signature again. "This is not clean." "Not clean?" "It looks like your wife's signature," she said. but it's too careful, too consistent. People don't write their own names like that unless they're trying to make it look a certain way. I nodded once. I thought the same thing. She turned back to the notebook.
And this, she said, tapping the page with the totals, this is not just a list. This is a record of contribution, time, money, responsibility. She looked at me again, and this time there was something different in her expression. Recognition. Not of me as a person she had met before, but of the situation as something she had seen in other forms, other houses, other families where quiet had been mistaken for agreement. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "does your name appear on the deed to the house currently?" "Yes." "Has that changed officially?" "Not that I've been told." "Good." She leaned back slightly, folding her hands in front of her. "Then what you're looking at is an attempt," she said, "not a completed action." "An attempt to do what?" "To move ownership without proper process. Or, at the very least, to position things so that process can be controlled later." The words were precise. They did not accuse, they described. "And the rest?" I asked, gesturing to the notebook. "That," she said, "is what keeps this from being dismissed as misunderstanding." She turned the notebook back toward me. "Most people come in here with a story," she said. "They tell me what they feel. They tell me what they think happened. It takes time to sort through that." She tapped the page once. "You brought me something else. You brought me what actually happened." The difference settled in the room. For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift that was not resistance, not confusion, not quiet endurance. Something steadier. "Can you help me?" I asked. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she opened a drawer, took out a folder, and placed it on the desk. "Yes," she said finally. "But we're not going to rush this." She looked at me directly. "They think you don't understand," she added. I did not smile. "That's what they said." Ruth nodded. "Then let's keep it that way for a little longer." The sentence landed with a weight that was different from anything Marcus had said, different from anything Evelyn had implied. It was not dismissive. It was not strategic in a way that felt like a game. It was protective. "Continue doing what you've been doing," she said. "Write everything down. Do not confront. Do not explain. Let them move forward under their own assumptions." "And then?" She closed the folder. "And then," she said, "we decide when it matters." I picked up the notebook. For the first time since I had started writing in it, it did not feel like something I was holding alone. I stood, nodded once, and turned toward the door. "Mr. Pierce," she said as I reached for the handle. I looked back. "You're not invisible," she said. It was a simple sentence, but it was the first time someone had said it out loud. The first time they used the word facility. They said it like they were talking about a place with better lighting. It was a Thursday evening, the kind that settles early into a quiet that feels organized, as if the house has agreed on a version of itself for the night, and everyone is playing their part inside it. I was at the kitchen table with the laptop open, not working, just looking at the same page long enough that it stopped being about what was on the screen and started being about the act of not moving. Evelyn came in with a folder in her hand. It was not the black folder Marcus used. This one was thinner, cream-colored, with a tab at the top that had been labeled in a careful, even hand. She set it down in front of me without sitting, the way she had been doing more often lately, as if remaining standing gave her an advantage she did not want to lose by lowering herself to the level of a conversation.
"Harlan," she said, her voice measured, not soft, not sharp, just placed carefully between the two.
We need to go over a few things.
I closed the laptop slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted the moment to move at a pace I chose.
All right, I said.
She opened the folder and turned it toward me. There were 4 documents inside, not stapled together, not presented as one thing. Separate, distinct, each with its own heading, its own language, its own set of signature lines waiting at the bottom, like empty conclusions.
What are these? I asked.
Updates, she said. The same word, the same tone, only now it carried more weight because it had already been used once before.
Updates to what?
To make things simpler, she said. To make sure everything is handled properly.
Handled properly.
I reached for the first page and read. It was a financial authorization, the kind that allows one person to manage accounts on behalf of another. My name was there. Evelyn's name was there. Marcus's name appeared in a section that had not been filled in before, not in any document I had signed in the past. The language was careful, technical, written in a way that made it sound like responsibility was being shared, when in fact it was being transferred. I turned to the second page. A medical directive. Not unusual for someone my age, not inappropriate. But the details were arranged in a way that placed decision-making authority in Marcus's hands in situations that had not been discussed with me. Words like incapacitated and unable to make informed decisions appeared in sentences that felt too ready, too prepared for something that had not yet been asked. The third page was a limited power of attorney, limited in name, not limited in effect. I read each line slowly, not skipping, not assuming.
I let the language sit in my head the way Ruth had taught me without saying it directly, by the way she read my notebook, by the way she did not rush past anything that mattered. The fourth page I did not recognize immediately. It was labeled Residency Consideration Form. I read that one twice. It outlined options: assisted living, long-term care, evaluation criteria, suggested timelines. Suggested timelines. I set the page down and looked at Evelyn. "What is this?" I asked again, but this time the question carried something else with it. Clarity. She did not look away. "It's just planning," she said. "We need to think ahead." "For what?" "For when things become more difficult." More difficult. The phrase hung in the air, not defined, not explained, left open so it could be filled with whatever meaning served the moment. "I'm not having difficulty," I said. "Not yet," she replied. There was no hesitation in it, no apology, just a statement. Marcus came in then, not from the front door but from the back, the way he did when he wanted to avoid the formality of entering through the space that still, on paper at least, belonged to all of us. He set his keys on the counter and walked over, not asking what we were discussing because he already knew. "Did you show him?" he asked. "I'm showing him now," Evelyn said. Marcus leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me read, the way you watch a process you have already approved. "Dad," he said, and there was something in his voice that tried to sound reasonable, something that tried to suggest this was a conversation between adults. "This is just about making sure everything is covered." "Covered," I repeated. "Yeah," he said. "Financially, medically, all of it." "And this?" I tapped the fourth page. "That's just an option," he said quickly, "in case we need it." "Need what?" He shifted slightly, just enough that the answer would not feel like it was being forced out of him. "More support," he said. "Professional support."
The word facility did not appear on the page. It did not need to. I looked down at the documents again, then back up at him. "And when did we decide I needed that?" I asked. "It's not about right now," he said. "It's about being prepared." Prepared. That word again. Everything was preparation. Everything was moving towards something that had not been said out loud, but had clearly been discussed enough that both of them knew the language by heart. Evelyn slid the pen toward me. "We're not asking you to do anything unreasonable," she said. "We just need your signature so we can move forward if necessary." If necessary. I picked up the pen, not to sign, to feel its weight. The room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when everyone in them knows something important is about to happen, and no one wants to be the first to break the surface of it. I turned the first page back and read the opening paragraph again. Then I turned to the second, then the third, then the fourth. I did not rush. I did not fill the silence. Marcus shifted once, the sound of his shoe against the tile sharp in the stillness. "Dad," he said, "it's not that complicated." "I know," I said. "Then just sign it." There it was. Not a request, not even an expectation anymore. A directive. I set the pen down. "I'm not signing these tonight," I said. The words landed heavier than I expected, not because they were loud, but because they broke something that had been running without interruption for a long time. Marcus straightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm going to read them again," I said, "and then I'll decide." "You've read them," he said, his voice tightening. "I've seen them," I corrected. "That's not the same thing." Evelyn stepped in before he could respond again. "Harlan," she said, and this time her voice was softer, but there was something underneath it, something firmer than before. "We don't have time to delay everything." "For what?" I asked. "For this," she said, gesturing to the papers, to the room, to the house, to whatever version of the future they had already agreed on. I held her gaze. "You've had time," I said. The sentence sat between us. Marcus exhaled sharply. "This is exactly what I was talking about," he said. "You're making things harder than they need to be." "Maybe," I said. "That's not good enough," he replied. "No," I said. "It isn't." There was a shift then. Not loud, not visible in a way that someone walking past the window would notice. But something changed in the room. The assumption that I would sign because I always had. The expectation that the process would continue without interruption. The belief that I did not understand enough to resist. It did not disappear, but it cracked. Marcus looked at Evelyn, then back at me. "You realize," he said slowly, "that if you don't cooperate, we're going to have to make other arrangements." "Like what?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Like getting you evaluated," he said, "to make sure you're still capable of making decisions." There it was. Not the word facility, but the path to it. Evaluation, capability, authority. I nodded once. "That makes sense," I said. He blinked. "What?" "If you think that's necessary," I continued, "you should do what you think is right." The calm in my voice unsettled him more than anger would have, because anger gives people something to push against. Calm leaves them without direction. Evelyn gathered the papers slowly, stacking them back into the folder with movements that were more deliberate than they needed to be. "We'll talk about this again," she said. I did not answer. Marcus picked up his keys. "This isn't over," he said. "No," I agreed. "It isn't." They left the room together.
I sat at the table for a moment longer, then took out the notebook. Thursday. Documents presented: financial authorization, medical directive, power of attorney, residency consideration. Declined to sign. Marcus mentioned evaluation, implied incapacity. I wrote one more line beneath it. They are ready to act. I closed the notebook and set it down. The house was quiet again, but it was not the same quiet as before. This one had weight. This one had direction. For weeks I had been watching. For weeks I had been writing. Now they had shown me how far they were willing to go. And once you know that, the next step is not reaction. It is timing. There is a moment after a door closes that most people don't think about. A small stretch of time where nothing moves and nothing announces itself, where the sound of the lock has already faded, but the meaning of it has not yet fully settled into your body. That moment is quieter than anger, quieter than shock, quieter even than disappointment. And it is in that quiet that decisions are made without being named as decisions. I stood on the porch with my hands empty and the late light slipping off the edge of the roof in a way that made the front steps look flatter than they were. The air had cooled just enough that it carried a different weight on the skin. Not unpleasant, just distinct. The kind of change you register without commenting on because you assume it will pass. Nothing inside the house moved. No footsteps, no voices. No attempt to open the door again and say that something had been misunderstood, that a line had been crossed by accident, that there was still a version of the day where I walked back inside and everything returned to its previous shape. There was no previous shape left to return to. I stepped off the porch slowly, not because I was unsure of where I was going, but because I wanted to feel the ground under my feet as something separate from the wood behind me. Gravel shifted slightly under my shoes as I crossed the short path to the driveway, the same path I had walked thousands of times, carrying tools, groceries, bags of leaves, things that belonged to a house I had once thought of as fixed. I did not look back. People say that in moments like that, you should turn once, take in the place, hold on to it so you can understand what you are leaving behind. But that only works if the place you are looking at still belongs to you in some way. That house had already moved away from me before I reached the driveway. Looking at it would have been an exercise in memory, not in reality. I opened the truck door and got in. The seat felt the same as it always had, the slight dip on the left side where my weight had settled over the years, the faint smell of oil and fabric cleaner that never fully leaves no matter how often you roll the windows down. I set my hands on the wheel, not gripping it, just resting them there long enough to confirm that something in my life was still exactly where I had left it. I started the engine. The sound was steady, familiar, something that did not ask me to explain myself before it did what it was built to do. I backed out of the driveway in a straight line, the way I always had, checking the mirror out of habit even though I had already decided not to look at the house. The street was quiet. A dog barked once in the distance and then stopped, as if it had remembered there was nothing to respond to. A car passed at the end of the block, headlights cutting across the intersection and disappearing before I reached it. The ordinary movement of a neighborhood continuing, without any awareness that something inside one of its houses had just ended. I drove without a destination for the first few minutes. Not lost, not wandering, just moving forward long enough for the idea of going back to become something that no longer felt available. My phone sat in the cup holder. It did not ring. That was something I noticed without looking at it directly. The absence of vibration. The absence of light. There was a time when I would have expected it to ring within minutes. A call from Evelyn asking where I had gone. A message from Marcus telling me to come back so we could talk this through.
A version of concern that would have arrived quickly enough to feel like an attempt to correct something. Nothing came. The road opened onto the main highway, and I turned without signaling, not because I was careless, but because there was no one close enough to need the information. The headlights stretched out ahead of me in a narrow line, the asphalt reflecting just enough light to guide the path forward without revealing anything beyond it. I drove for 20 minutes before I realized I had not decided where I was going. That realization did not bring panic. It brought something else. Space. For years, my movements had been defined by need, by requests, by the quiet expectation that if something had to be done, I would be the one to do it. Every drive had a purpose that belonged to someone else, a task at the end of it, a responsibility waiting to be completed before I could consider my time my own again. That night, there was no task, no one waiting, no place I was supposed to arrive. I pulled into a small motel just off the highway, the kind of place that does not advertise itself beyond a flickering sign and a row of doors that all look the same. The office light was on. A man sat behind the counter with a newspaper folded in half, reading the same page more than once, the way people do when they are not actually reading. "I need a room," I said. "For how long?" "I'll let you know in the morning." He nodded, slid a key across the counter, and did not ask anything else. Room 12. I carried my notebook in my hand, not in my pocket. Not because I was afraid of losing it, but because it had become something I did not want out of reach, even for a few seconds. The room smelled faintly of detergent and something older beneath it, something that had settled into the walls over time. There was a bed, a small table, a lamp, and a chair that had been placed in a position that suggested someone had once sat there for a long time without moving it afterward. I set the notebook on the table and sat down on the edge of the bed. The silence in the room was different from the silence in the house. It did not carry expectation. It did not hold conversations behind doors. It was just quiet. I took out my phone and looked at it for the first time since leaving the driveway. No missed calls, no messages. The screen was blank in a way that felt almost deliberate. I set it down again without unlocking it. Then I opened the notebook. Thursday, 6:12 p.m. Returned home, door locked, Marcus outside. "You're just a burden now." Keys taken, door locked from inside. I paused, pen resting against the page. Then I added the next line. 6:18 p.m. Left property. No further contact initiated. I closed the notebook and placed it back on the table. The room stayed quiet. Time moved forward in the small ways it always does. The hum of the air unit turning on and off, the distant sound of a car door closing somewhere in the parking lot, the faint vibration of footsteps passing by outside without stopping. I lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. There was a crack running from one corner to the other, not unlike the one in the downstairs room, only this one was newer, sharper, less settled into the structure around it. I followed it with my eyes, the way I had done before, the way you do when you need something simple to focus on while your mind moves through larger things. I did not think about going back. I did not consider calling. I did not draft a message in my head or rehearse a conversation that would allow me to explain what had happened in a way that would make it easier for them to accept. Explanation belongs to people who are still negotiating. I was not negotiating. Sometime after midnight, I turned off the lamp. The room went dark in a way that felt complete, not like the half-light of the house where something was always left on, where someone was always awake enough to notice movement. Here, the darkness was allowed to be what it was. My phone did not ring. I slept. When I woke up, The light coming through the thin curtains had already shifted toward morning, pale and even, the kind that does not announce itself so much as replace what was there before. For a moment, I did not move, not because I was unsure of where I was, but because I wanted to feel what it was like to wake up without a list waiting for me. No tasks, no requests, no one expecting me to be somewhere other than exactly where I was. I sat up, reached for the notebook, and wrote the date. Friday. Woke in motel. No contact from house. I underlined the last line once. Then I closed the notebook and set it aside. If you stay with me here, you'll see that what happened next didn't come from anger, not in the way people usually mean it. It came from something quieter, something that had been building for a long time without being named. In a little while, you'll understand why I did not knock on that door again, why I did not call, and why 3 days later, the phone would not stop ringing. If you want to see how it ends, you can subscribe, but don't go anywhere just yet. I stood, washed my face in the small sink, and looked at myself in the mirror. I did not look different. That was the part most people miss. Change does not always show up in the face. Sometimes it shows up in what a man no longer agrees to do. I picked up the key, stepped outside, and closed the door behind me. The morning air was cooler than the night before. The world had continued, and for the first time in a long time, I was not late for anything. The first call came at 8:12 on a Sunday morning, the kind of time when most people are still moving slowly through their day, when coffee is still hot, and the light through the curtains has not yet decided what kind of afternoon it will become. I knew it was them before I looked at the screen, not because I expected it, but because the silence of the previous 2 days had already begun to feel like something that would have to correct itself eventually. Marcus. I let it ring, not out of spite, not as a performance, but because answering would have required me to step back into a conversation that had already been decided without me. I watched the name on the screen until it disappeared, the phone settling back into stillness as if nothing had happened. Then it rang again. This time, Evelyn. I did not pick up. By the third call, I turned the phone over so the screen faced the table, not to hide from it, but to remove the part of it that asks for your attention with light. Sound is easier to ignore than light. Sound fades. Light insists. The motel room was the same as it had been the night before. The same chair, the same crack in the ceiling, the same quiet that did not ask anything from me. I had stayed because leaving too quickly would have felt like running, and I was not running. I was simply not returning. I opened the notebook and wrote the time. Sunday, 8:12 a.m. Marcus called. No answer. 8:14 a.m. Evelyn called. No answer. 8:16 a.m. Marcus called again. No answer. I did not rush the entries. I wrote them the same way I had written everything else, with the same even pressure, the same spacing, the same refusal to let urgency change the structure of what was being recorded. By 9 a.m., there had been 7 calls. By 10:30, there had been 12. I counted them without reacting to them, the way you count something mechanical, something predictable once you understand the pattern. It was not panic yet. It was correction. They were trying to restore a connection they believed still existed, a line that had always been open because I had always answered. I did not answer. At 11:05, a message came through. "Dad, where are you? We need to talk." I read it once. Then I placed the phone back on the table without replying. The second message came from Evelyn. "Harlan, please call me. This is important." Important. That word had been used before, in different tones, in different contexts, always to move something forward that had already been decided. It did not carry the same weight anymore. I wrote it down. 11:05 a.m. Marcus text. We need to talk. No response. 11:12 a.m. Evelyn text. This is important. No response. The 12th call came at 11:40. I did not count out loud. I did not mark it differently. It was just another entry. Around noon, I left the motel and drove to a small diner down the road. The kind of place where the coffee is poured without asking, and the menu has not changed in years. I sat at the counter, ordered eggs and toast, and placed the notebook beside my plate like it belonged there. The waitress did not ask about it. She refilled my coffee twice. The phone rang once while I was eating. I let it ring. When I finished, I paid in cash, left a tip that matched the service, and walked back to the truck without checking the screen. There was no need to confirm what I already knew. By the time I returned to the motel, the count had reached 18. 18 calls in less than 4 hours. I wrote the last one down. 12:58 p.m. Marcus called. No answer. Total, 18 calls. I underlined the number once. Then I closed the notebook. It was not satisfaction in the way people imagine it. There was no sudden rush of triumph, no feeling of having won something that had been contested openly. It was quieter than that. It was the recognition that the balance had shifted, that the same silence they had relied on to move things forward without me had now become something they could not control. For years I had been available. Now I was not, and they did not know how to adjust. The next part came later that afternoon, not as a call, but as a message from a number I did not recognize. Mr. Pierce, this is First County Bank. Please contact us regarding recent changes to your account access. I read it twice. Then I smiled. Not outwardly, not in a way that anyone else would have noticed, but in the small internal way that comes when a piece of a larger structure confirms what you have already put in motion. I had gone to the bank on Friday morning, not to close anything, not to remove money, just to adjust access, to separate what had been shared without question into something that required one. Ruth had been clear. You don't take, she had said, you protect. So I had protected. Account permissions changed, authorization levels reduced, notifications redirected. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden, just a return to the structure that should have been there all along. Now they were seeing it. I wrote it down. Sunday, 2:15 p.m., bank message. Account access changes noted. At 2:40, Marcus called again. Number 19. I did not answer. At 3:05, Evelyn left a voicemail. I listened to it once. Harlan, she said, and her voice was different now. Not calm, not measured, but strained in a way that suggested the plan had encountered something it had not anticipated. We need to understand what you've done. The accounts. Something's not right. Please call me. I saved the message. I did not respond. By evening, the tone of the messages had changed, from instruction to request, from request to uncertainty. Marcus, call me. Evelyn, we need to fix this. Marcus again. Dad, this isn't funny. Funny. That word told me more than anything else they had said that day. They still believed this was a reaction. They still believed I would return once whatever point I was making had been made. They did not understand that I had not left to prove something. I had left because something had already been proven. I went back to the notebook and added the last entries of the day. 4:10 p.m. Evelyn voicemail. Concern about accounts. 4:45 p.m. Marcus text. This isn't funny. No response. I closed the notebook and set it on the table. The room was quiet again, the same quiet as before, but now it held something different. Not emptiness, control. For the first time since the documents appeared, since the conversations in the kitchen, since the slow removal of my name from the things I had built, I was no longer reacting to what they were doing. They were reacting to what I had already done. The phone did not ring again that night, not because they had stopped trying, but because they had started thinking. And thinking takes time. I turned off the lamp and lay back on the bed, the same crack in the ceiling running from one corner to the other, unchanged, steady, indifferent to the shift that had taken place beneath it. 18 calls, 18 attempts to restore something that no longer existed. I did not feel the need to answer any of them, because for the first time, the silence belonged to me. The first time I went back to the house, I did not go inside. It was late in the afternoon, the kind of light that flattens everything just enough to make it look familiar without revealing what has changed underneath it. And I parked across the street instead of pulling into the driveway, because there was no reason to make an entrance where I was no longer expected.
The truck idled for a moment before I turned it off, the engine settling into silence the way it always did, as if nothing about the world outside had shifted in the last few days. The house looked the same. That was the part that stays with you longer than it should. The siding had the same small discoloration near the corner where I had patched it years ago. The mailbox leaned at the same angle. The window above the porch still reflected the tree across the street in a way that made it look like something was moving inside, even when it wasn't. From a distance, nothing had been taken. Up close, everything had. I did not step out right away. I sat with both hands resting on the wheel, the notebook on the passenger seat where it had been for the last 3 days, the pages inside it carrying more weight than they had when I first started writing. It had begun as a way to remember. It had become something that could stand on its own without me explaining it. That difference mattered. I had met Ruth again that morning. Her office was the same as it had been the first time, the same light, the same stillness, the same sense that nothing inside it moved unless it needed to. She had reviewed the documents again, not because she had to, but because she understood that repetition is how you confirm what you already know. "They overreached," she said, not with satisfaction, but with certainty. "They moved too quickly, and they assumed too much." I nodded. "They thought I wouldn't understand." "They needed you not to understand," she corrected. "That's different." She had filed what needed to be filed. Not a lawsuit, not a demand. A correction. Ownership reaffirmed. Authorization adjusted. Any attempt to transfer without proper execution formally blocked. The kind of action that does not make noise, but changes what can and cannot happen moving forward. "They can't move the house without you," she said. "Not legally. Not now." "And the rest?" She closed the folder. "The rest is up to you." That was the part no document could decide. Back in the truck, across from the house, I understood what she meant. I could go inside. I could knock on the door and wait for it to open and stand there while they tried to explain what had already been explained by their actions. I could sit at the table and listen to Marcus tell me that things had gotten out of hand, that they were only trying to plan ahead, that I was misunderstanding something that had been done for my benefit. I could let Evelyn speak in that same careful tone, the one that turned decisions into suggestions and expectations into kindness. I could return. But returning would not change what had already been revealed. It would only ask me to accept it. I opened the truck door and stepped out, not toward the house, but toward the sidewalk. I stood there for a moment, the late light catching the edges of the roof, the same porch where I had stood 3 nights earlier with keys that no longer opened anything. I did not feel anger.
That was something I noticed clearly. No heat in the chest, no urgency in the hands. Just a steady recognition of where things stood. I took the notebook from the passenger seat and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Not heavy in the physical sense, but solid in a way that memory alone never is. Every entry, every date, every small task that had once been invisible now existed in a form that did not require anyone's agreement to be true. I did not need to show it to them. That was the part people misunderstand. Evidence is not always for the other side. Sometimes it is for you. I walked back to the truck, set the notebook down, and got in. I did not knock on the door. I did not call. I drove away. The next few weeks moved in a way that did not require much from me beyond consistency. The accounts remained as they had been adjusted. The documents did not reappear.
There were messages at first, fewer than the 18 calls on that Sunday, but enough to show that they were still trying to understand the boundaries that had replaced what used to be open. I did not respond to most of them, not out of punishment, because there was nothing left to negotiate. Ruth handled what needed to be handled. Notices sent, records updated. The kind of quiet work that does not look like change until you try to move something and find that it no longer shifts the way it used to. Marcus stopped calling after the second week. Evelyn sent one more message after that. "We can talk when you're ready." I read it once, then I set the phone down. There was a time when I would have answered immediately, not because I had something to say, but because silence would have felt like a failure on my part, like I had left something undone that I was responsible for completing. That time had passed. I rented a small place a few miles from the motel, not far from the highway, not close to anything that required explanation. One bedroom, one kitchen, a window that faced west so the light came in at the end of the day instead of the beginning. It was enough. I moved my things in myself. There were not many. A few clothes, the tools I still used, the notebook, the second notebook, the phone, the things that had always been mine, even when I had not been paying attention to what belonged to me and what belonged to the house. The first night I slept there, the silence felt different again. Not empty, not unfamiliar, just quiet. The kind of quiet that does not expect you to fill it. I woke up the next morning without a list. No bills on the counter that required immediate attention. No calls waiting to be returned. No tasks assigned in a tone that made them sound optional when they were not. I made coffee. I sat by the window. I opened the notebook. And for the first time, I did not add a new entry. There was nothing to record. That absence did not feel like loss. It felt like space. The legal process concluded the way Ruth had said it would, without spectacle, without confrontation, without a final moment where someone admitted they had been wrong. Ownership remained where it had always legally been. Attempts to move it without me were no longer possible. The rest, the relationships, the conversations, the explanations that might have been offered if I had returned, remained where I had left them, unresolved. I did not pursue anything further. I did not file for damages. I did not try to recover the money I had spent, the hours I had given, the things that had been taken without being named as taken. Not because those things did not matter, but because chasing them would have required me to stay connected to a version of my life I had already stepped out of. There are some things you can win on paper and still lose in time. I chose not to spend more of mine. If this story meant something to you, you can leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you the most. You can subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this, and there's another one waiting for you after this. I keep thinking about that night, standing outside my own house, holding keys that no longer opened anything. Not because the lock had changed, but because the meaning of the door had.
And I think about the notebook, about the quiet record of every small thing I did that no one noticed until it mattered enough to be seen all at once. Some people don't lose everything in one moment. They lose it slowly, piece by piece, until one day there is nothing left to give that hasn't already been taken for granted. And sometimes, the decision that changes everything is not loud, not dramatic, not even visible from the outside. Sometimes it is just a man stepping away and choosing not to return. Not revenge, just taking his name back.